The morning Silas Stone rode down from the high country with the winter's worth of pelts strapped across his pack mule was the same morning Alice Walker stood in the dirt outside the Caldwell County Land Office and learned she had 11 days left before everything her father had built would belong to a man she despised. It was the autumn of 1882, and the town of Harrow Creek, Colorado sat in a wide valley between two ridges of the Rocky Mountains like a jewel dropped carelessly by some traveler passing through. The Platte River wound through the eastern edge of town, and the cottonwood trees along its banks had turned gold, their leaves shaking loose in the October wind and drifting across the main street in little spiraling eddies. The mountains above town were already capped with the season's first snow, and anyone who had lived in that valley long enough knew what was coming. Winter in the high country came hard and fast, like a debt collector who gave no grace. Alice Walker was 24 years old, and she had the kind of quiet, determined beauty that wasn't immediately obvious but settled on you slowly, the way the warmth of a fire settles over a room. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, because the Colorado sun was relentless even in autumn, and her eyes were a striking shade of gray-green that shifted depending on the light and her mood. She stood 5 feet and 5 inches tall, and the work of running a homestead alone for 2 years had made her lean and capable, with strong hands and a straight back and a mouth that pressed into a firm line when she was holding something difficult together inside herself. She was holding something very difficult together right now. The man behind the land office desk had the soft, damp look of someone who had never done a hard day's physical labor in his life, and he explained the situation with the calm detachment of someone reading from a ledger, which he was. Her father, Thomas Walker, had taken out a land loan 2 years ago to purchase the seed and equipment needed for that season's planting after a hailstorm had destroyed his previous crop. Thomas Walker had died of a fever 18 months ago, and Alice had been making the payments, small as they were, until 3 months back when the northern pasture fence had collapsed, and she had needed every spare cent to repair it before the cattle got out onto the open range and were claimed by other ranchers. 3 missed payments. That was all it took. And the man who held that loan was Harlan Driscoll, which was the worst possible version of this situation that Alice could have imagined. Harlan Driscoll was 47 years old and owned a cattle operation north of town that was 3 times the size of her father's homestead. He had been trying to acquire the Walker property for years, first through offers to her father that Thomas Walker had flatly refused, and more recently through increasingly pointed conversations with Alice herself that made her skin crawl. Harlan Driscoll wore expensive shirts and smelled of hair oil, and he had a way of smiling that never reached his eyes. And what he wanted from the Walker homestead was the creek access on the southern boundary, because that creek ran year-round, and his northern operation went dry in summer. Alice had already been to see the town's only lawyer, a young man named Percy Holt, who was barely older than she was, and who had passed the bar examination in Denver just 2 years prior. Percy had looked at the loan documents for a long time without speaking, and then he had told her, very gently, that Harlan Driscoll had every legal right to foreclose. The only way to stop it was to pay the 3 missed payments in full plus the legal fees Driscoll had already incurred, which came to $231.40. $231.40. Alice had walked out of Percy Holt's office and stood in the autumn sun and done the arithmetic of her situation. She had $62 in the tin box under her floorboard. She could sell 2 of her milk cows, but the market for cattle in autumn, when everyone was selling before winter feed costs hit, was poor. She might get another $40 that way if she was lucky. She could sell her father's rifle, which was a good rifle, and maybe get $12 for it. That still left her more than $100 short, with 11 days until Harlan Driscoll's men showed up with a legal notice and the authority to remove her from the land where she had been born. She was standing in the dirt outside the land office, looking at the mountains and trying to find something inside herself that felt like hope, when the sound of heavy hooves and the jangling of pack equipment drew her attention down the main street. She turned, and that was the first time she saw Silas Stone. He rode a large, dark bay horse with the ease of a man who had spent more time in the saddle than out of it, and behind him came a sturdy gray mule loaded with the most impressive collection of winter pelts Alice had ever seen in one place. There were beaver pelts stacked in neat bundles, dark and thick and lustrous, along with the larger, silver-tipped hides of what looked like wolf and fox, and several enormous bear hides that draped across the mule's back like blankets. The pelts alone spoke of a man who knew the mountains with genuine intimacy, who could read sign and move through wilderness that would kill most people. But it was the man himself that made Alice stare for a moment longer than was entirely polite. Silas Stone was somewhere around 30 years old, and he was built on a scale that seemed almost impractical for ordinary life. The kind of powerful, broad-shouldered frame that came not from any deliberate effort, but simply from decades of hauling, climbing, chopping, and surviving in terrain that demanded everything you had. His shoulders were enormous, stretching the seams of his worn buckskin jacket, and the forearms visible below his rolled sleeves were corded with muscle, roped with sinew that moved visibly beneath his tanned skin when he shifted the reins. He had dark brown hair that fell to his collar and was slightly wavy from the mountain wind, and a beard that was neatly kept but full, framing a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. His eyes, when they passed over the street and briefly touched on her, were a deep, quiet blue, the color of mountain water in shadow. He did not linger his gaze. He pulled his horse to a stop outside the trading post and dismounted in one smooth motion, and the earth seemed to briefly acknowledge the weight of him. And then he was tying off his animals and disappearing inside with the particular purposefulness of a man who had a specific thing to do and no interest in doing anything else first. Alice stood in the street for a moment that was perhaps 3 seconds longer than it needed to be, and then she put Silas Stone entirely out of her mind, because she had larger problems, and she walked to the general store to buy the small amount of flour and lamp oil she could still afford. She did not know that her problem and his arrival in Harrow Creek were already, quietly, beginning to occupy the same small space in the world. The inside of Cartwright's trading post smelled of tobacco and tallow and dried leather, and old Marcus Cartwright himself stood behind the long wooden counter, with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and his arms crossed, because he had been in the business of buying pelts for 31 years, and he knew immediately that what had just walked through his door was exceptional. Silas Stone set the first bundle of beaver pelts on the counter without ceremony, and Cartwright picked one up and turned it in the lamplight with the reverence of a man handling something genuinely fine. "Where are you working?" Cartwright asked. "North Range," Silas said. His voice was deep and unhurried, the kind of voice that came from years of speaking primarily to mountains and rivers. "Above the timberline in stretches. I work a trapline that runs from the Fork Creek drainage up to the Shelf Lakes." "I didn't think anyone was working that country anymore," Cartwright said, setting the beaver pelt down and picking up another. "Too remote, too rough." "That's why I work it," Silas said simply. Cartwright went through the pelts methodically, making notes on a piece of paper with a stub pencil, and when he was done he looked at his figures and then looked at Silas Stone over his glasses. "I can offer you $165 for the lot," he said. "The beaver alone is worth that," Silas said without raising his voice or changing his expression. Cartwright recalculated. They went back and forth the way men in that business always did, with the patience of people who understood that the number would eventually land somewhere that worked for both of them. And when they were finished, Cartwright wrote a bank draft for $212, which was a good price and both men knew it. Silas folded the draft into the breast pocket of his jacket and walked out into the autumn light. He resupplied first. That was habit and good sense. Coffee, flour, dried beans, salt, ammunition. A new skinning knife to replace the one he had broken on a frozen log in February, lamp oil, and several yards of heavy canvas for patching his mountain shelter before the deep snow came. He worked through his list at the general store with the methodical focus of a man who had learned that overlooking small things in the supply phase cost you dearly 6 months later when you were trapped on a snowbound mountain needing the thing you forgot. It was while he was paying for his goods that he first heard the name Alice Walker. The store owner, a round-cheeked woman named Edna Briggs, was talking to another customer across the counter, and their voices carried easily in the quiet store. The other customer was a woman with a sympathetic face and lowered eyebrows, and she was saying, in the way people say things they want to be heard saying, that it was just a genuine shame about Alice Walker's situation, and that Harlan Driscoll ought to be ashamed of himself, calling in that loan the way he was doing, and everyone in the valley knew he only wanted that property for the creek access, and poor Thomas Walker must be turning in his grave. Silas gathered his change without comment, but he filed the information away in the quiet, orderly way that men who spent months alone in the wilderness learned to process things. When you had only yourself to talk to, you listened more carefully to the world around you. He took his supplies back to his animals and lashed them properly, and then stood for a moment looking down the main street, the mountain wind carrying the smell of pine and coming snow, and let himself think. He did not know Alice Walker. He had not been in Harrow Creek for nearly 8 months. He had wintered in a camp high above the valley and come down only when he had something to sell or something to buy, and the social workings of the town below were largely unknown to him beyond the basic geography of commerce. But he knew the name Walker. He knew it because Thomas Walker had been one of the men who had given him honest dealing when he first came into the valley 6 years ago, a young man of 24 with a good knowledge of mountains and a need to prove himself and nothing else to his name. Thomas Walker had sold him a used trap set at a fair price, and had drawn him a careful map of the creek drainages in charcoal on a scrap of paper, and had said, with the directness of a man who respected effort, that if Silas worked hard and learned the country, there was a living to be made up there. That map had been the foundation of everything Silas had built in the years since. He owed Thomas Walker a debt that no amount of time quite settled. He untied his horse and led both animals to the water trough at the far end of the street, and while they drank he looked at the bank draft in his hand again and did some arithmetic of his own, and then he made a decision with the same clean simplicity he brought to all decisions in the wilderness, where hesitation cost lives. He found Percy Holt's law office through the simple method of asking the first person he passed, and he pushed open the door and ducked slightly to fit under the frame and sat down across from the young lawyer and laid the situation out in plain terms. "I understand Alice Walker has a loan obligation she can't meet," he said. "I want to understand what it would take to clear it." Percy Holt looked at Silas Stone with the careful expression of a man trying to determine if this was a charitable impulse or something more complicated. "Are you a relation of hers, a family friend?" "I knew her father," Silas said. "That's enough for me." Percy explained the situation in the same terms he had given Alice, and when he was done, Silas asked him to confirm the exact figure, and Percy wrote it on a piece of paper, $231.40. Silas looked at the number for a moment. He had $212 from the Pelts. He had another $63 in his trail kit, money he had saved from the previous spring sale that he had been holding for an emergency or an opportunity. Together, that was $275, which was more than enough. "Can I pay the loan directly through you?" he asked. "Without going to Driscoll. The loan can be paid to the lien holder, which is Driscoll's operation, or it can be paid through this office as a legal settlement," Percy said slowly. "If paid through this office with proper witnesses, it creates a clean legal record and the lien is discharged. Driscoll would have no grounds to dispute it." "Then let's do it that way," Silas said. Percy sat forward in his chair. "Mr. Stone, I need to be clear with you. This is a considerable sum. Have you spoken with Miss Walker about this? No, Silas said. Don't you think you should? Silas was quiet for a moment. I think, he said carefully, that if I go to her first she'll say no, and the problem won't get solved. So I'll pay the obligation and then I'll go to her and she can be as angry with me as she needs to be, but at least she'll still have her land. Percy Holt looked at him for a long moment and then did something that surprised even himself, which was to nod slowly and reach for his ledger. They drew up the papers that afternoon. Silas paid $231.40, which came to his entire bank draft plus all but $43.60 of his savings, leaving him with enough to resupply but not much beyond that. The legal documents were signed by Silas Stone, witnessed by Percy Holt and the land office clerk who was brought in for the purpose, and stamped with the official seal that made it binding and real. The Walker homestead lien was discharged in full. Harlan Driscoll's claim was legally extinguished. Now Silas had to go tell the woman what he had done. He found out where the Walker homestead was through a combination of asking Percy Holt and reading the simple lay of the land once he was riding south of town. The property was 1.5 miles outside Harrow Creek, set back from the road on a gentle rise, with a good solid farmhouse and a barn and several outbuildings, and the creek running along the southern edge exactly as people had described. It was good land. He could see why Driscoll wanted it. The late afternoon light was coming in low and golden from the west when Silas rode up the lane toward the house, and the first thing he heard was an axe striking wood in a steady, purposeful rhythm that suggested someone who had been at it for a while and was not planning to stop soon. He rounded the corner of the barn and found Alice Walker splitting wood in the yard behind the house, and she was very good at it, which somehow didn't surprise him. She heard his horse and stopped mid-swing, turning to face him with the axe still in both hands, her hat pushed back on her head from the exertion, a strand of dark auburn hair lying across her cheek. Her gray-green eyes were sharp and assessing, and there was nothing soft or helpless in her expression. She looked at him the way a person looks at an unexpected thing in a familiar landscape, not frightened but alert. "Help you," she said. He swung down from the saddle and tied his horse to the fence post and walked toward her. Even from a distance he was clearly large, and up close the effect was more pronounced. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches, and his presence filled a space the way a boulder fills a stream bed, not aggressively but simply, unavoidably. "My name is Silas Stone," he said. "I'm a trapper and hunter. I work the mountains north of the valley." Alice studied him. "I've heard the name. I don't know you." "You don't," he agreed, "but I knew your father. He did me a good turn when I was starting out, sold me a trap set and drew me a map of the creek drainages. That map is the reason I've made a living in these mountains for 6 years. Something shifted very slightly in her expression. "He never mentioned you," she said. "No reason he would have. We only spoke a few times, but a good turn is a good turn." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the legal documents Percy Holt had copied for him, folded carefully, and held them out to her. "These are for you." She looked at his hand and did not take the papers immediately. "What is that?" "The discharge of the lien on your property," he said. "The loan Harlan Driscoll held has been paid in full. Your land is clear." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight and texture. Alice Walker did not move for what felt like a very long time. Then she said in a voice that was very carefully controlled, "What did you just say?" "The lien has been discharged," he said again patiently. "The loan is paid. Your land is yours free and clear." The axe came down out of her hands and planted itself in the chopping block, and she reached out and took the papers from him with fingers that were not quite steady, and unfolded them right there in the yard in the dying afternoon light. She read them once and then read them again, and her throat moved as she swallowed. Then she looked up at him with those gray-green eyes, and what was in them was complicated. There was relief so enormous it looked like pain, and there was gratitude that she was clearly fighting with something that sat above it, and what sat above it was pride. "You paid it," she said. "You paid my father's loan." "Yes." "Without asking me." "Yes," he said again. The complicated look in her eyes sharpened considerably. "Mr. Stone, I appreciate what you were trying to do, but you had no right to do it. That was my debt, my problem, my land. You had no business making that decision without speaking to me first." "I know that," he said. "Then why did you?" He considered the question honestly. "Because you would have said no." The truth of that statement landed in the air between them, and Alice opened her mouth and closed it again, because she recognized the truth of it too, and the fact that he had known it without knowing her at all was deeply unsettling in a way she could not immediately articulate. "I would have found another way," she said. "With 11 days, he asked, not unkindly. "You don't know what I might have managed in 11 days. "No," he said, "I don't. You might have pulled off something remarkable. But the chance was not good, and your father drew me that map, and I couldn't walk away from that and live comfortably with myself." Alice looked at the papers in her hands again and then folded them with great care, the same care she might have given something fragile, and when she looked up at him again the anger had not gone, but something else was present alongside it, something more complicated and human. "How much?" she asked. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me. How much did you spend?" He told her. She absorbed the number in silence. "That's your whole season's take," she said. She knew enough about trapping to understand what that meant. "Most of it," he said. "I kept enough for supplies. You need that money for your winter operation." "I'll make do," he said. She studied him for a long moment and then said, in a tone that had lost some of its sharpness and acquired something rower in its place, "Why would you do that for a woman you don't know, based on a map and a favor done to you 6 years ago?" He looked at her steadily. "Your father was a straight-dealing man. I've met precious few of those in my life. And you're his daughter, standing out here splitting wood alone at the end of a hard day, fighting to keep something that should have been safe to begin with. Driscoll's been circling this property for years. Everyone in town knows it. What he's doing is legal, but it isn't right, and I had the means to stop it, so I did." There was a silence in which the wind moved through the cottonwood trees along the creek, and the late light burnished the golden leaves to something almost luminous, and a hawk passed in a long, lazy arc across the pale blue of the autumn sky. "You'll need to be repaid," Alice said. "Every cent. I will repay you. You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to. I'm telling you I'm going to." The firmness in her voice was not aggressive but absolute, the kind of determination that came from a person's core and had no flexibility in it. "I won't be in debt to a stranger." "All right," he said simply. He did not argue the point, because he could see that it mattered to her, and honoring what mattered to people was something he knew how to do. She looked at him for another moment, and something in her softened by the most infinitesimal degree, which in Alice Walker's case was enough to be visible if you were paying attention. "Have you eaten?" she asked. "Not since morning." "Then come inside," she said, pulling the axe out of the chopping block and carrying it to the woodpile. "I have a venison stew on the stove. You can eat, and you can tell me more about how you knew my father, and I can figure out how I feel about all of this while I'm doing something useful with my hands." He followed her inside, ducking through the doorframe, and the house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and stew, and the particular combination of clean and well-used that belongs to homes maintained with care and very little extra money. There was a braided rug on the floor and a cast-iron stove against the north wall, and a table with 4 chairs that had clearly once held a family and now held one woman's solitary meals. There were dried herbs hanging from the rafters and a shelf of books above the fireplace, and a daguerreotype on the mantelpiece that Silas looked at as he settled into a chair. A man with a square jaw and quiet eyes, older and gray-haired, with a young woman's hand visible at the edge of the frame. "My father," Alice said, ladling stew into a bowl without looking at him. "Taken the summer before he died." "He looks like a man who knew his own mind," Silas said. "He did," she said, and brought 2 bowls to the table and sat across from him. "He also knew everybody else's mind, which was occasionally frustrating. He would have liked you, I think. He always respected people who did things the direct way. Even if the direct way stepped on some toes." The corner of her mouth lifted very slightly. He would have said your motives were right even if your method needed work. That's fair, Silas said, and picked up his spoon. They ate together in the firelight, and the stew was good, rich with onion and the dark, gamey depth of well-cooked venison. And the biscuits she brought out were light despite being made in a cast-iron skillet. And Silas ate with the focused appreciation of a man who had been living on his own camp cooking for months. She watched him across the table with the careful assessment she gave everything, and he answered her questions about her father directly and honestly, telling her what he remembered of their conversations, the directness of Thomas Walker's manner, the quality of the trap set he had sold, the detail and accuracy of the map he had drawn. Alice listened to all of it and said nothing for a moment when he finished, and then she said quietly, "He never talked much about the people he helped. He thought talking about it was a form of seeking credit, and seeking credit made the help smaller somehow." "He was right about that," Silas said. She looked at him across the table in a new way. "You're a lot like him, you know." Silas didn't answer that, but he held the observation carefully. He stayed that evening until the fire had burned low, and they talked in the way that people sometimes talk when circumstances have stripped away the usual social scaffolding and left them standing in something more basic and real. She told him about the last 2 years, the difficulty of running the homestead alone after her father died, the fence collapse that had taken her savings, the sick dread of seeing the legal notice from Driscoll's operation. He told her about the mountains, about the trapline and the shelf lakes and the particular quality of silence above the timberline in deep winter, a silence so complete it seemed to press on you from all sides like something solid. When the fire was truly low, she said he could sleep in the barn if he needed a place, and he said he appreciated the offer, but he had a camp set up already at the edge of the tree line above town, and he would use that. He said it practically, but she could tell he meant it, that he was not a man who accepted hospitality he didn't need, and she respected that. He stood at the door and put his hat on and said, "Miss Walker." "Alice," she corrected without thinking, and then looked slightly surprised at herself. "Alice," he said, and the way he said her name was quiet and direct, the way he said everything. "I'm in town for a few more days before I head back up. If there's anything that needs doing around the property, I have the time." She opened her mouth to say she was perfectly capable of managing her own property, which was true, and closed it again, because she thought of the section of barn roof that had been worrying her and the fence along the north field that was 2 posts short of what it should be. And she was not so proud that she would refuse practical help that was genuinely offered. "The barn roof needs patching," she said, "and there's a fence section on the north field. I'll come back in the morning," he said, and stepped out into the cold night. She stood at the window and watched him ride away through the dark, the massive shape of him on the dark bay horse fading into the moonlit distance, and she held the legal documents still in her hand and looked down at them and felt the relief wash through her now that she was alone and did not have to be strong in front of someone else. Then she put the papers in the tin box under the floorboard where she kept important things, and she went to bed. And she lay in the dark for a long time thinking about blue eyes and a voice like mountain water, and a man who had spent every cent of his season's earnings for a woman he barely knew, because her father had once drawn him a map. Silas Stone was back at the Walker property before 7 in the morning, which was when Alice was finishing the morning milking, and had her hair still loose around her shoulders, in the particular morning state of a person who hasn't yet set themselves into the shape the day requires. She looked up from the milk pail and saw him walking in through the barn door and felt a startling, inconvenient rush of warmth at the sight of him, which she attributed immediately to the fact that the morning air was cold and the barn was warm. He brought his tools from his pack, and they were a mountain man's tools: a good hand saw, a hammer, a draw knife, a roll of heavy wire. He assessed the barn roof from the ground first, walking the perimeter and looking up with the evaluating eye of someone who had built and maintained structures in conditions far worse than a valley barn faced. Then he said he needed to see it from above, and he climbed the ladder to the roof with the ease of a man for whom heights were an old acquaintance, and spent a while up there in the cold morning air while Alice milked the second cow and tried not to keep looking up at the ladder. He came back down with a clear picture of what was needed and spent the better part of the morning on it, and Alice, who had work of her own to do, found herself taking longer at the tasks nearest the barn than was strictly necessary. The sound of his hammer was steady and sure, and somewhat comforting in the way that competent work always is. She brought him coffee at mid-morning, which was the polite thing to do, and he accepted it with a brief nod and drank it standing on the barn roof, looking out at the valley from above with an expression she couldn't quite read from the ground. When she called up to him that the view must be good from there, he said it was, and that the mountains to the north were putting on more snow, and that if the pattern held they'd have a hard winter. "Good for your trapping, then," she called back. "Good for the trapping," he agreed, and there was something thoughtful in his voice. At noon she fed him again because he had earned it and because it was simply the right thing to do, and they sat on the porch steps with plates of cold cornbread and dried apple preserves and more coffee, and the autumn sun was warm enough in the midday stillness that it almost felt like summer if you didn't look at the mountain peaks. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. Do you ever get lonely, up in the mountains alone all winter?" He considered the question the way he considered everything, without rushing. "Sometimes," he said. "In February, when the snows have been deep for 2 months and the light is thin, that's when it gets quiet in a way that has some weight to it." "Why do you do it then?" "Because it's the life that fits me," he said simply. "I tried other things. I worked cattle drives for 2 seasons out of Kansas. I worked a stint at a mine near Leadville. Neither of those things felt like what I was supposed to be doing. But the first time I set a trapline in high country and spent a week moving through that landscape and reading it and understanding it, I knew that was the shape of the life that belonged to me." Alice turned her cornbread over in her hands. "That must be a good thing to know, the shape of the life that belongs to you. You don't know yours." "I know this land," she said, looking out at the fields and the creek and the mountains beyond. "I know this place. I know I'm supposed to be here, but sometimes I wonder if the shape of it was always supposed to be this solitary." He looked at her sideways. "You're 24 years old," he said. "Thereabouts," she said, and smiled, and it was the first real smile he had seen from her, sudden and unguarded, and it transformed her face into something he found himself looking at for a moment too long before he looked back at the mountains. He finished the barn roof that afternoon and started on the fence in the north field before the light went. He was methodical and efficient, and the posts went in with a solidity that suggested they would be standing long after both of them were gone. Alice came out to the field with a water bucket and walked the fence line with him, pointing out the sections that had worried her, and they moved through the late afternoon light together with the easy practicality of 2 people, discovering that their rhythms matched without either of them having looked for that. When the fence was done, he stood back and looked at it in the fading golden light and said it would hold through the winter. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply and directly, without the complicated qualifications that had surrounded her earlier gratitude, and he could hear the difference. Something had settled between them in the past 2 days, some basic question of character on both sides that had been asked and answered without words. "I want to ask you something now," he said. "All right. Harlan Driscoll. Will this stop him, or will he find another angle?" Alice's expression became very still. "He'll find another angle," she said. "He always does. The creek access is what he wants, and he's not the kind of man who walks away from what he wants. Do you have any legal protection on the creek boundary?" Percy Holt drew up a riparian rights document 2 years ago when Driscoll started making noise about it. "The creek access is mine as long as I hold the homestead title." She paused, "which I now do, free and clear." "Then his best avenue was through the loan, and that's closed," Silas said. "He can try making you an offer again." "He can try," Alice said, and the flatness in her voice made it clear what she thought of that. "He might not stop at an offer." She looked at him directly. "He has before." Silas was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "If he gives you trouble, I want to know about it." She raised an eyebrow. "Are you appointing yourself my guardian?" "No," he said. "I'm telling you that if someone gives you trouble, I'd like to be aware of it." He paused. "That's a different thing." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the fence and said, in a tone that was not agreement but wasn't refusal, "I'll keep it in mind." He left at dusk, and she watched him ride toward town through the blue fall twilight, and she did not name to herself what she was feeling because she had more than enough to manage without adding that to the inventory. Silas spent his last evening in town at the small boarding house on the east side of Harrow Creek, and he sat in the common room with a cup of coffee that was not very good, and did some thinking that he had been putting off for 2 days. He had the income from his pelts mostly spent. He had enough supplies for the winter operation. He had a trapline to run that would produce another season's worth of pelts come spring, and the money from that would put him back where he had been before this week. He was not troubled by the money. Money was a tool, and he had spent it on something that mattered, and he had made money before and would again. What he was troubled by, in the quiet way a man is troubled by something he can't quite resolve into a clean answer, was Alice Walker. Specifically, the fact that he had ridden away from her property twice now, and felt each time as though he were leaving something behind. He was not a man who had given much thought to women in recent years. The mountain life was a solitary one, and he had accepted that as the price of the freedom and wildness he could not live without. He had known a woman in Leadville, briefly, years ago, but the connection had not survived the distance and the difficulty, and he had retreated back to the mountains and not looked back with much regret. He had assumed, in the vague way that men assume things they haven't examined carefully, that the solitary shape of his life was its permanent shape. But Alice Walker had a quality he had not expected and could not easily name, a combination of genuine toughness and genuine feeling that made her very alive in a way that most people were not. When she was angry, she was all the way angry. When she was grateful, she was all the way grateful, even when she was fighting the gratitude with both hands. And when she had smiled unexpectedly on the porch steps in the afternoon sun, she had been completely and entirely present in the smile, and something in him had shifted on its foundations. He finished his bad coffee and went to bed, and in the morning he rode back to the Walker property one more time, telling himself it was to check his fence work, which was partly true. She was feeding the chickens when he arrived, the early morning light catching the auburn in her hair where it had come loose from her pin, and she looked up at him as he rode in with an expression that had something welcome in it that she was not quite managing to conceal. "The fence looks good," he said, dismounting. "It does," she agreed. "Come and have coffee, I made extra." They sat at the kitchen table in the morning quiet, and the coffee was excellent, dark and strong, and outside the window the last of the cottonwood leaves were spinning loose in the October wind, and the mountains were very white against the pale blue sky. "You're heading back up today," she said. It was not quite a question. "Tomorrow," he said. "I have one more thing to arrange in town." He paused. "I wanted to come and say goodbye first." She turned her cup in both hands. "That's kind of you," she said, and the word came out differently than it might have, with a texture that he caught. "Alice," he said, because he was a direct man, "I'm going to be in the mountains until April. When I come down in spring, I'd like to come and see you, if that's all right." She looked at him steadily, and in her expression was the recognition of a woman who understood exactly what was being said and was deciding what she thought about it. "You should know," she said, "that I'm not the sort of person who will be waiting at the window while you're gone." "I wouldn't want you to be," he said. "And I'm not easy," she said, with a directness that matched his own. "I have opinions, and I'm not in the habit of keeping them to myself, and I run this place my own way, and I don't plan to change that." "I'd think less of you if you did," he said. She held his gaze for a long, considering moment, and then she said, "Come and see me in the spring then, Silas Stone. We'll see what we think of each other after a winter apart." He nodded, and the simple nod held more warmth than a long speech might have. He left the next morning, and she did not watch at the window because she had told him she wouldn't. But she stood at the porch railing with her coffee in both hands and watched him ride north toward the tree line until the dark shape of him and his animals was swallowed by the pines. And then she went inside and got to work. October moved into November and November into December, and the snows came to the valley the way Silas had predicted, hard and serious. And Alice worked the homestead through the winter with the focused determination she brought to everything. She hired a young man from town named Billy Marsh for 2 half-days a week to help with the heavier work, paying him from the small income the milk cows provided, and she kept careful accounts in a ledger and watched the numbers with the vigilance of someone who never wanted to be in the position she'd been in before. Harlan Driscoll came to see her in November. He arrived on a cold, gray afternoon with his hat in his hand and his best shirt under his coat, and he sat in the chair across from her kitchen table and made her an offer for the property that was, she had to admit, a fair market price. She looked at him across the table and saw in his face the particular calculation of a man who had moved to his second strategy, and she said, with perfect courtesy, that she was not interested in selling, and that she appreciated him coming by, and that she was very busy. He stood up and put his hat on and said he hoped she'd think it over, and she said she had, and she ushered him out and closed the door, and that was the last she saw of Harlan Driscoll that winter. She did not tell Silas about the visit because Silas was on a mountain somewhere, and there was no way to tell him anything, and besides, she had handled it herself. She thought about him, though, in the particular way she thought about things she was not quite ready to examine directly, which was obliquely, from the side, in quiet moments. She thought about the blue of his eyes and the way his voice sat so steadily in whatever he said, and the quality of attention he gave to things, a deep, patient attention that made you feel thoroughly seen, which was not always a comfortable experience but was always an honest one. She wrote a letter in February that she didn't send, because she didn't know where to send it. She folded it and put it in the tin box under the floorboard with the legal documents, and she went back to work. Spring in the Rockies came late and argumentative, with snowstorms in April that looked like February weather, and then a warm week that turned everything to mud, and then another cold snap. And then finally, in the second week of May, the air settled into something that smelled genuinely like new growth, and the meadows began to green, and the creek ran high and fast with snowmelt. Silas came down from the mountains on a morning in the third week of May, riding the same dark bay horse with the same gray mule behind him, loaded again with the winter's take. He looked thinner than he had in October, the deep winter lean of a man who has been burning more than he's been eating for months, but his color was good, and his eyes were clear, and he rode with the same easy authority as before. He went to Cartwright's first, because that was how things were done, and this season's pelts were even better than last year's because he had worked the trapline hard all winter. Cartwright examined them with unconcealed admiration and wrote a bank draft for $244, and Silas folded it into his pocket and resupplied, and then rode south out of town without stopping anywhere else first, which anyone who had been paying attention would have found telling. Alice was in the garden when he arrived, on her knees in the soft spring earth with her hands dark with soil, and she was wearing her old work dress, and no hat, and her hair was loose. And when she heard his horse on the lane, she looked up and shielded her eyes against the morning sun and saw him coming, and something moved across her face before she could stop it, something bright and involuntary that she arranged into simple pleasantness by the time he reached her. She stood and wiped her hands on her apron and said, "You made it down." "I made it down," he said, and swung off the horse and stood in front of her, and she noticed the winter had written itself on him in new ways, a few more lines around his eyes, a deeper weathering to his skin, but the essential quality of him was exactly as she remembered, that settled, powerful presence that made everything near him feel more real. "You look thin," she said. "March was hard," he said. Come inside. I have eggs and cornbread and I just made a fresh pot of coffee. He followed her inside and she cooked while he sat at the table, and the ease of it, the way they occupied the kitchen together without awkwardness or performance, struck them both in their private thoughts as remarkable that they could feel so comfortable in proximity after 6 months apart. Over breakfast, he asked about the winter and she told him, including the visit from Harlan Driscoll, which she mentioned with deliberate casualness. The deliberate casualness did not land the way she intended. He came here, Silas said. He made an offer, a fair market offer. I declined. Did he accept that? He did, she said. He left without incident. Whatever Driscoll is, he's not the kind of man who makes direct threats. He works through legal and commercial pressure. Silas was quiet for a moment and then he said, I'm glad you told me. I told you I would keep it in mind, she said. I believe I also told you I was capable of handling my own affairs. You are, he said. I've never doubted that. She looked at him across the breakfast table, and the morning light was coming through the east window and laying itself across his hands where they wrapped around his coffee cup. And she thought about the winter and the letter she had not sent, and the way she had obliquely circled the thought of him for 5 months. Silas, she said. What are you planning to do with your spring? He looked at her with those steady blue eyes. I was hoping to spend some of it here, he said. If you'll have me, there's work to be done on any homestead after a hard winter and I'd like to be useful. And the rest, she said. After the work. I'd like to get to know you better, he said, simply and directly. And see if what I've been thinking about for 5 months on a mountain is something real or something I invented in the loneliness. Alice set down her coffee cup very carefully and then said, in a voice that was extremely even, What have you been thinking about? You, he said, fairly constantly. She pressed her lips together, and then she said, in a tone that had something like exasperation and something like wonder in it in equal parts, That is both honest and inconvenient. I know it, he said. I've been thinking about you too, she said, because she was not a woman who lied about things when the truth was just as available. Rather more than I would have preferred. They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the May morning light, and the understanding that passed between them was quiet and large, and felt like the first warm day of spring feels when it comes after a very long winter. He stayed. He was not presumptuous about it. He made his camp at the edge of the tree line at the property's northern boundary, the same high, clean spot where he had camped in October, and he came to the farmhouse each morning and worked alongside Alice through the day and ate dinner with her in the evenings, and rode back to his camp each night. They moved through the spring work with the easy complementarity of two people whose skills happened to align in the best possible way. She knew every inch of the property and every system of the farm, the rhythms and needs and troublesome spots, and he brought a physical capability and a practical problem-solving approach that worked through the backlog of deferred repairs with impressive efficiency. He fixed the root cellar door that had been swelling and sticking all winter. He relaid the hearthstone that had cracked and settled. He helped her clear the winter debris from the kitchen garden and turn the soil and lay the seed beds, while she directed the layout from her kitchen garden plan, which was detailed and sensible and spoke of someone who had been thinking about it all winter. He split enough wood to see the property through 2 winters, working in the mornings with his jacket off, the steady, powerful rhythm of the axe strokes carrying across the yard, and Alice made a point of not looking out the kitchen window too often and was only partially successful. They talked. This was what surprised them both most, perhaps. Mountain men were not generally known for conversation, and Alice had been solitary long enough that the habit of long discourse had somewhat faded, but together they were oddly fluent. He told her about the geography of the high country in the particular detail of a man who had memorized it over years, the names he had given to features, the characteristics of the different drainages, the shelf lakes that froze to a foot of ice in December and thawed to mirror clarity in May. She told him about her childhood on the homestead, the years when her father and mother had both been alive, and the farm had hummed with the fullness of a complete household. And then the years after her mother died of influenza when Alice was 14 and the farm had contracted around the two of them. She was 26 now and had spent 2 years alone. The farm was hers and she was going to hold it. Those two facts were more than background. They were the architecture of who she had become. He understood architecture of that kind. He had built his own from different materials but with the same necessity. In early June, on a warm Thursday evening when the meadows were fully green and the evening light came in long and golden, and the fireflies were beginning to appear above the creek in small, quiet sparks, he took her hand as they walked back from the south field where they had been checking the fence line. He took it simply and naturally, without announcement, and she looked down at their joined hands and then up at him. And then she said nothing, but let her fingers curl around his, and they walked back to the house in the warm evening with the fireflies winking above the creek. He kissed her for the first time on the porch that same evening when she had turned from the door to say good night, and it was a direct and honest kiss, the kind that came from genuine feeling rather than performance, and she was still for a moment after it ended, and then she looked at him and her gray-green eyes were very clear and she said, "I was wondering when you were going to do that." "Were you?" he said, and there was warmth in his voice. "For about 3 weeks," she said. He laughed, and it was a good laugh, the kind that sounds like it has been given free rein, and she smiled at the sound of it. The summer unfurled like something planned from the beginning, each day adding itself to the last in a slow accumulation of richness that neither of them had expected, and both of them had, in different ways, been afraid to hope for. He stayed at his camp through June and into July, spending his days at the farm and his evenings at her table and his nights under the stars, until she said one morning over coffee that it was impractical to have him camping in the tree line when there was a perfectly good bunk in the spare room, and that she was not going to be squeamish about propriety when practicality was available. He moved into the spare room with his few possessions, which fit into a single pack with room to spare, and the household settled around two people with a naturalness that felt like something being completed rather than something new being begun. In August, when the late summer heat lay heavy over the valley and the afternoon smelled of warm grass and dust, and the creek ran low and clear, he asked her to marry him. He asked her in the kitchen, after dinner, while she was washing the dishes and he was drying them, because that was the kind of proposal that suited who they were. He put down the drying cloth and turned to face her and said, in the direct and quiet way he said everything, that he loved her, and that he would like to spend his life with her, and would she marry him. Alice set down the dish she was washing and turned to look at him in the kitchen lamplight, and her eyes were bright in a way that she did not bother to contain, and she said, "I've been in love with you since February and I didn't even know you properly. Yes, I'll marry you." He put his hands on both sides of her face and kissed her, and outside the kitchen window the warm August night was full of cricket song and the distant sound of the creek and the smell of hay drying in the fields, and everything that needed resolving between them had resolved into something clear and true. They were married in September of 1883, 1 year and nearly 2 weeks after he had ridden into Harrow Creek with a mule loaded with winter pelts. Percy Holt stood up for Silas in lieu of family, because Percy was the closest thing to a friend he had made in Harrow Creek, and Edna Briggs from the general store stood with Alice and kept crying at inopportune moments, which Alice bore with patient affection. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Jonas right in the small white church at the edge of town on a perfect September afternoon, when the aspens on the mountain slopes above were turning gold, and the air was that particular crystalline Colorado quality that made every outline sharp and every color true. Alice wore a dress she had made herself from pale cream muslin, simple and well cut, and her dark auburn hair was pinned up with small wildflowers woven through it, and she was so beautiful that Silas, who was not a man given to being struck dumb by anything, stood very still at the altar and felt something so large moving through him that he wasn't sure his ordinary frame could contain it. He wore a new shirt and his best jacket, and he had trimmed his beard, and he stood in the small church with his broad shoulders and his mountain-weathered face and his steady blue eyes, and looked at her coming down the aisle with the directness he gave to all things. And Alice, who had promised herself she would not cry because she was not a crier, blinked twice and pressed her lips together and kept walking. They said their vows in the September afternoon light with the witnesses around them and the smell of wildflowers from the little vases on the windowsills. And when Reverend Wright said the words were done, Silas cupped Alice's face in his large hands the same way he had in the kitchen in August and kissed her very gently. And the small congregation clapped, and Edna Briggs cried more enthusiastically. The question of the trapline was one they worked out between them over the months that followed with the same practical directness they applied to everything. Silas had his winter season in the mountains and Alice had her homestead, and neither was willing to abandon what was theirs, and they were both sensible enough to understand that a person giving up the essential thing about themselves for love was not a gift but a slow damage. They established the arrangement that would define the working shape of their life. Silas would work the trapline each winter from November through April, and spend the spring, summer, and early fall at the homestead. Alice would run the farm year-round, with Billy Marsh taking on a more permanent hired-hand role during the winter months when Silas was in the mountains. It was not a conventional arrangement for 1883, but then they were not conventional people, and the arrangement suited them with a logic that was its own argument. The first winter of their marriage was the one Alice would later describe as the winter she learned what she was actually made of. Not because she had been fragile before, but because the full weight of the farm in winter, while also carrying the knowledge that the man she loved was alone in the high country, with the serious cold pressed on her in a different way than the previous solitary winters had. She wrote him long letters that she kept in a box by the bed because there was still no way to send them, and she ran the farm and managed the accounts and kept Billy Marsh employed and watched the mountains with the particular watching of someone who knew the person on them, and she counted the weeks until April with a patience that surprised her. He came down in late April, thinner than she would have preferred but with excellent pelts and clear eyes and a quiet contentment at the sight of the farmhouse lane, and the smoke from the kitchen chimney that settled in his chest like something placed there with care. She met him at the fence gate and he swung down from the horse and she walked right into his arms without ceremony, and he held her with the full strength of those enormous arms, and she pressed her face against his chest and breathed him in, the mountain smell of him, cold air and wood smoke and spruce, and neither of them said anything for a long moment because there was nothing that needed saying. "Good winter?" she asked into his jacket. "Long," he said, "but good." The shelf lake above the upper camp froze to 2 feet in January. "I've never seen that before." He paused. "And I missed you every single day." She pulled back enough to look at his face. "I wrote you 43 letters." Something moved in his eyes. "You did?" "I have them in a box by the bed," she said. "You can read them all, or I could just tell you the gist, which is that I love you and this arrangement has a gap in it that I could feel in my chest all winter, and I'm very glad you're back." He kissed her there by the fence gate in the April morning, very thoroughly, and the gray mule stood patiently beside the dark bay horse, and the spring light lay warm over the greening fields, and everything that had been apart was together again. The winter letters became a tradition. Alice wrote them all winter and gave them to him each spring, and he read them in a sitting in the kitchen with his coffee while she watched his face, and he laughed in some places and went very still in others, and when he was done, he always said something that was worth having heard. She kept all of his spring letters in a larger box, and they became a particular kind of record of their years. By the autumn of 1884, 2 years into their marriage, Alice told him that the winter was going to be different this year, and he looked at her in the kitchen lamplight and understood what she meant and sat down in the chair with the slow, careful settling of a man on whom something very significant has just landed. "When?" he said. "April," she said. "You'll be down by then. I've thought about it." He looked at her for a moment, and then he stood and came around the table and gathered her against him with a gentleness that was striking in a man his size. And he said quietly into her hair that she needed to be careful this winter. And she said she was always careful, and he said he knew that, and they stood in the kitchen for a long time in the lamplight. He was more reluctant than usual to leave for the mountains that November, and Alice had to practically push him out the door on departure day, which she did with the brisk practicality she used for things she was also feeling strongly about. "I will be fine," she said. "Billy Marsh is here 3 times a week. Edna Briggs has already promised to check in regularly. Mrs. Wright from the church has offered to help when the time comes. I have more support than I need and a better constitution than half the women in this county." "I know all of that," he said, with one boot already out the door and one clearly reluctant to follow. "Then go," she said, "and come home in April." He came home in the first week of April, riding hard for the last 2 days because something in the air and the light and the quality of the season told him it was time. And he arrived at the Walker homestead on an April morning to find that he was, in fact, 3 days late. Thomas Silas Stone, named for both his grandfathers in the particular way of people who want to honor 2 histories at once, was 3 days old and had opinions about this, which he was expressing with great lung capacity when Silas walked through the farmhouse door. Alice was in the rocking chair by the fire with the baby at her breast, and she looked up when Silas came in, and her face was tired and radiant in the way of women who have done the most extraordinary and ordinary things simultaneously, and she said simply, "Come and meet your son." Silas crossed the room in 3 strides and crouched in front of the rocking chair, and looked at the small red-faced bundle that was his son, and something shifted in him at a fundamental level, like a mountain range accepting a new river, and he reached out one large, calloused finger and the baby's entire hand closed around it with an instinctive grip that was startlingly strong. And Silas Stone, who had faced blizzards alone and built his life in some of the most unforgiving terrain in the American West, felt his eyes fill in a way he did not bother to conceal. "He has your jaw," Alice said softly. "He has your opinions," Silas said, because the baby had released his finger and resumed his previous complaint. Alice laughed, and it was the best sound in the world. He never left in November the same way again. He rearranged the trapline over the following seasons, working more efficient routes that allowed him to be down from the mountains by late March reliably. And Billy Marsh, who had proven himself capable and trustworthy, eventually took on a full winter position at the farm that made the whole operation function more smoothly. The trapline income combined with the homestead income created a life that was not lavish, but was genuinely good, solvent and secure and free of the anxiety that had characterized Alice's situation before Silas had ridden into Harrow Creek with his winter pelts and his simple sense of what was right. Young Thomas grew into a boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's decisive jaw, and a personality that combined Silas's patience with Alice's directness in a way that was sometimes alarming and always engaging. He followed his father everywhere from the moment he could walk, and Silas brought him into the mountains for his first overnight camp at age 6, and the boy was absolutely fearless about it in a way that made Alice, who was not generally a worrier, privately pray very hard. In the summer of 1887, when Thomas was 3 and Alice was 29 and Silas was 35, Alice told him at the kitchen table over their morning coffee that they were going to need the spare room back. Silas set down his cup. "Again, December," she said. He smiled, and it was the smile she loved best, the one that started slowly and then arrived completely, transforming his weathered face into something open and warm and fully present. "I'll be down from the mountains by then," he said. "I know you will be," she said. Clara Jane Stone arrived in December of 1887, which was as predicted, and Silas was very much present for it and held Alice's hand through the whole thing with the same steady strength he brought to everything and said very little, which was exactly right. And when Clara arrived, she was red-faced and furious and absolutely perfect. And Thomas, who had been waiting in the kitchen with Billy Marsh, was brought in to meet his sister and announced with authority that she was very small. "She'll get bigger," Silas told him. Thomas considered this. "How long does it take?" "A while," Silas said. "You'll need to be patient." Thomas regarded his father with the expression of someone weighing the cost of patience against the anticipated reward and finding the arithmetic inconclusive. "All right," he said finally, in the tone of someone conceding a point under duress. Alice watched her husband and her son from the bed and felt something so complete and fully formed that it was almost impossible to hold inside an ordinary moment. By the late 1880s, Harrow Creek had grown considerably from the small trading town it had been in 1882. The railroad had come through 20 miles south, and its secondary effects were being felt even in the valley, in the form of better prices for cattle and farm goods, and the arrival of new settlers who were moving west with the confidence that the land of promise was genuinely available to them, though Alice knew well enough by now that the land of promise had to be fought for and maintained with vigilance, and was never simply given. Harlan Driscoll had eventually sold his northern cattle operation in 1886 and moved to Denver, which Alice received as information without particular emotion. He had made 2 more offers on the Walker property over the years, both at fair market prices. Both declined without drama. He had accepted the reality of Alice's refusal with better grace than she had expected of him, possibly because his commercial empire had expanded sufficiently that the creek access had become less critical to his overall operation. He was simply a chapter that had closed. The trapline became legendary in the Harrow Creek area over the years, not because Silas advertised it, but because the quality of his pelts was consistently exceptional, and traders and buyers came to know his name. He began to be consulted by other trappers who were starting out, and he gave his advice with the same directness and generosity with which Thomas Walker had given him his starting knowledge, which he was aware of and which he took seriously. There was a young man named Daniel Graves who came to Harrow Creek in 1889 with the intention of working the mountains and no real knowledge of how to do it. He was 19 years old and entirely too confident about what he didn't know, and Silas spent 3 days drawing him maps and explaining the country and selling him a good used trap set at a fair price, and Alice watched from the kitchen doorway and recognized something she had seen described once years ago in the account of how her husband had gotten his start. When Silas came inside, she said, "You know what you're doing." "Teaching him the basics," Silas said. "No," she said. "You know what you're doing." "Why you're doing it." He looked at her and she looked at him, and no other words were needed for that conversation. Thomas Walker was gone, but the way he had moved through the world was still moving through it, transmitted by the specific chain of generosity that Silas carried and was now passing forward, and that was as close to permanence as any of them were going to get, and it was more than enough. The winters continued. Silas always came home. The letters accumulated in their boxes, the record of 2 solitary winters pressed up against each other across the distance of mountains, full of small observations and larger feelings, and the ordinary extraordinary texture of 2 specific lives being lived in proximity to something wild and true. In the spring of 1890, when Thomas was 6 and Clara was 3, and the homestead was running better than it had in its entire history, Silas came home from the mountains in late March and found Alice in the garden with both children and a very muddy dog of uncertain parentage that had apparently adopted itself to the household sometime in February. The dog examined Silas with the serious suspicion of a creature who took its household responsibilities seriously, and then sat down in the dirt and allowed itself to be petted with the air of something extending professional courtesy. "His name is Trapper," Thomas announced from behind his mother's knee. "Is it?" said Silas. "I named him," Thomas said. "I see." "He herds the chickens," Thomas said, with an authority that suggested this was the dog's primary credential. Silas looked at Alice over the children's heads, and she was smiling in the way she smiled when she was genuinely delighted, and the May afternoon light was in her auburn hair, which had a few silver threads in it now that he found devastatingly beautiful, and the homestead spread out behind her in the full green promise of spring, and the mountains above were just releasing the last of their snow, and all of it, every particle of it, was exactly as it was supposed to be. He came to her across the garden and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his side with the ease of 8 years of leaning, and they looked out at the fields and the creek and the sky together, Thomas chattering something to the dog, Clara attempting to follow a butterfly with the single-minded focus of a 3-year-old and the motor coordination of one, the farm making all its spring sounds around them. "Good winter?" she asked. "Long," he said, as he always said. "But good." He paused. The shelf lake above the upper camp froze to 3 feet in January. She turned her face up to look at him. "That's the deepest you've seen." "It is," he said. She studied his face, reading the lines of the winter in it the way she had learned to over the years, the places where the cold and the solitude had pressed and the places where something warm and internal had held. "The letters were good this year," she said. "I wrote 51. "I know," he said. "You told me on the last page of the last one." "I was counting," she said. "I know that too," he said, and pulled her a little closer. Thomas, who had perfected the timing of a 6-year-old for interrupting significant moments, came running over to show his father something he had found in the dirt, which turned out to be an arrowhead of the type left by the Ute people who had moved through this valley long before any of them were born. Silas took it and turned it carefully in his fingers, and then crouched to Thomas's eye level, and talked to the boy about it with the full and patient attention he gave to everything, explaining what it was and how it was made, and what it told you about the people who had made it. And Thomas listened with the intense absorption he reserved for information coming from his father. Alice watched them from her height, her husband and her son crouched in the spring dirt with the arrowhead between them, the enormous mountain man and the small boy with his blue eyes, and she thought about a morning in October of 1882 when she had stood in the dirt outside the land office and looked up at the mountains and tried to find something that felt like hope. She had found rather more than hope. She had found the whole shape of a life. The farm went on. The mountains went on. Silas and Alice went on, through the seasons and the years, through the ordinary extraordinary accumulation of a life lived in full, in the Walker homestead in Harrow Creek, Colorado, with the creek running along the south boundary and the mountains rising to the north, and the cottonwood trees turning gold each autumn and the aspens shimmering silver green each spring, and everything, all of it, belonging to them and through them to their children, and through their children to whatever came next. The tin box under the floorboard held the legal documents still, the discharge of the lien that had been the beginning of everything, and beneath those documents were Alice's winter letters, neatly bundled, and beneath those, folded and slightly creased, a map drawn in charcoal on a scrap of paper, faded now with years, a map of creek drainages in the high country that a straight-dealing man had once given a young man starting out, and that had started a chain of generosity that was still going. Thomas Walker was in every good thing that came from it. He was in the map and the trap set, and the decision made in a law office in October with $231.40, and the whole season's take. He was in the way his daughter stood her ground and ran her farm and loved her husband with the same fullness she gave to everything, holding nothing back and losing nothing essential. He was in the way his son-in-law came down from the mountains each spring with excellent pelts and quiet eyes, and came straight to the fence gate without stopping anywhere else first. He was in Thomas Silas Stone, who would grow up to be a man who knew these mountains the way his father did, and knew this land the way his mother did, and who would inherit both knowledges and carry them forward into a century that would require everything the frontier had taught. He was in Clara Jane Stone, who had his daughter's auburn hair and his son-in-law's blue eyes, and a fierce independence that satisfied everyone who encountered it, that certain qualities pass through families not by blood, but by example and by love. On a September evening in 1892, 10 years after Silas Stone had ridden into Harrow Creek with his winter pelts, he and Alice sat on the porch of the farmhouse in the autumn dusk, which was their habit. The children were inside at their supper. The mountains were going to winter colors above the valley, the aspens pure gold against the dark evergreen, and the creek made its quiet sound along the south boundary, and the air was just beginning to carry the year's first cold. Alice had her hands around a cup of coffee and her feet on the porch railing, a posture that would have shocked most of Harrow Creek's more conventional residents, and that Silas found completely perfect. 10 years, she said, looking at the mountains. More or less, he said. You came into town with a mule full of pelts and paid a debt you didn't owe, she said. And now here we are. Here we are, he agreed. She turned her head to look at him, this man who was the whole shape of her life, who had ridden out of the mountains at the right moment with the right quality of heart and the means and the willingness to use it correctly. He was 40 years old, and the years in the mountains had made him a particular kind of beautiful, the way certain landscapes are beautiful, with the accumulated authority of weather and time, and his blue eyes were as steady as they had ever been, and they were on her face right now with the full attention she had fallen in love with before she had understood what was happening. I love you, she said simply, because it was what was true, and she had never been a person to ornament the truth. I love you, he said, in the direct and quiet voice that had first spoken her name as though it were something worth saying carefully. The evening settled over the valley. The mountains stood as they had stood for ages before the settlers came and would stand for ages after, indifferent to everything except their own slow geology. But in this particular autumn dusk, they seemed to Silas Stone the most benevolent feature of a world that had given him more than he had ever believed himself entitled to. A woman who was his match in every way that mattered. 2 children with the best of both of them in them. A piece of good land that was held and safe, and would be held and safe for as long as any of them could see forward. A life shaped precisely around the things he loved, the mountains and the wilderness and the knowledge that ran in him from years of moving through country that demanded everything you had, and also this porch and this woman and this farm, and the particular quality of autumn, light in this specific valley that he knew now he would never stop finding remarkable. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had taken it on that June evening years ago by the south fence, and she turned hers to hold his, and they sat together in the autumn dark with the mountains above them and the creek below them, and everything between them resolved and whole and good. Inside the house, Thomas was telling Clara something with great authority about the arrowhead he kept on the windowsill in his room, and Clara was responding with the quality of polite skepticism she reserved for her brother's more extravagant claims, and the cast-iron stove was warming the kitchen, and supper was on the table, and the lamp was burning, and the tin box under the bedroom floorboard held all the letters and the legal documents and the old charcoal map. And the homestead of the Walker family stood on its rise above the valley, with the creek running along its southern edge in the mountain-cold September dark, held and permanent and real, exactly as it was supposed to be, exactly as it was always going to be, from the moment a mountain man had looked at a bank draft and done the arithmetic and made the simple, transforming decision that it mattered what happened to one woman's piece of Colorado ground. It had mattered. Everything that came from it had been the proof.